Is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good evening, Tulane parents. This is Penny Wyatt, the Director of Parent Programs and External Relations in the Division of Student Affairs. We are happy that you've joined us tonight for our on-campus housing reapplication and room selection process presentation. We have a lot of information to share with you, and just to kind of help us kind of get the lay of the land here, I want to explain a couple of things in case you haven't participated in one of our webinars before. So at this point, all of you are muted, so you will not be able to speak and ask questions, but you can type in questions into the control panel on your screen. And we ask that you hold your questions until the end, because we've tried very hard to anticipate your questions and build that information into the presentation. But I'll cue you when you can start typing your questions. Also, I want to just make sure that you can hear everything. So if you would use the raise your hand control on your control panel, just so that I know that you can hear me. I'll wait to see some hands go up. Okay, so if the volume is not quite what you want, then just remember you can adjust the volume on your side on your computer. Now, the other thing I want to just remind you is that you don't need to worry too much about frantically trying to take notes while we're going through the presentation, because I will send you an email with a PDF of all the slides and a link to the recording so that you can see it again if you want to, or pass it on to someone else. But don't worry too much about trying to capture everything tonight, because you'll get all of the slides. And then eventually, sometime next week, those will go on our Parent Programs Webinar archive online, and you can find that at parents.tulane.edu. And then if you have any feedback after the webinar, you are welcome to send that to me at parents@tulane.edu to our email address. So I am pleased to introduce my colleague, Kyle Rice, who's the Interim Associate Director for Operations in our Housing and Residence Life Department. And she is going to lead you through this presentation, and then we'll let you know when it's time for you to ask questions. So I'm going to turn things over to Kyle.
Hi parents, I'm excited to be here talking to you tonight about our returning student room selection process. This process is very similar for students that are returning from last year, but for our first year students, this will be an entirely new process because they will go about selecting their own room. And so we're going to talk tonight a little bit about the types of housing we have available, what the process is, the timeline, and hopefully answer the majority of your questions. So jumping right on in, we wanted to talk about who lives on campus. So as you likely know, all of our first and second year students are required to live on campus. We define first and second year by when they started at the institution. It's not defined by class year or credit. So if they started at Tulane in the fall as a first-time freshman, then they have one more year with us before they have an option of whether they choose to live on or off campus. But first and second years are not the only students that we house. We do have plenty of options and spaces available for our third and fourth year students, or juniors and seniors. And I think there's a lot of compelling reasons for them to live with us on campus: proximity, safety and security, and a lot of things like that. But we do offer a variety of different housing types, and we'll kind of talk about that, and we'll talk a little bit about where those juniors and seniors do choose to live typically. So one of the most important things is that all students going through the housing selection process are going to have to complete an application, and they will do this online using their housing portal. They can access their housing portal from our website or from Gibson, and if they're currently living with us on campus, they've likely already done that at least once, and so your student likely knows exactly how to access their housing portal. Okay, so why live on campus? Research shows that students who live on campus tend to be more satisfied with their collegiate experience. And statistically, they also perform better academically nationally. And part of that is because they are so close to the academic resources, the support, the social activities on campus. So they're just sometimes a little bit better connected to the services provided and just the culture of what's happening on campus. In addition to that, campus housing has some security features like staffing, overnight security staff, secured swiped exterior access entrances that may or may not be available at an off-campus apartment or in a house that might be rented. And so while your student might not always think about the safety and security of where they're living, especially if they're looking to go off campus, I'm sure that parents typically are. And I do think that that's an important conversation to have for those of you that have rising juniors and seniors that are considering going off campus. That should definitely be a factor in where they choose to live, whether it be on or off for next year. Housing and residence life are in every building on our campus to provide support and promote success for our residential students. So all of our buildings are overseen by a master's level professional. There are also student staff, resident advisors available in all of our communities to help our students acclimate to campus, to be there in times of an emergency. And we have our on-call staff in the evenings. Okay, so let's talk more about the actual reapplication process. So there are three major pieces of this process. The first is kind of the investigation of housing options. So we have a lot of ways that we try to disseminate this information to students. The first that they're going to get is starting just with emails about, hey, the process is coming, check out information on our website and things like that. We also will have housing expos and presentations where students can actually tour our upper class areas and see what rooms like before they select them. We have presentations that are going to walk them through every aspect of the returning student room selection process. And along with all of that, we also have some roommate matching events for students that may not have somebody that they want to live with for next year, but they don't necessarily want to go completely random. And then the other investigation piece is, talking with their roommates about what they plan to do for next year, what kind of housing they're looking at, because this is the time where they start to decide who they're going to live with and what areas they're going to try to live in. So after they've kind of had those conversations, the next piece is they apply for housing and they sign their housing agreement for the 2018-2019 school year. And that's a relatively short application. That application will go live right after they return from winter break. And then they will be able to kind of apply through January, and we'll talk a little bit more in detail about the timeline. And then the next piece really is housing selection. And for our parents of current freshmen, something that's a little bit different for them this year is they actually choose their room for next year from the available upper class rooms. And so we'll talk about what that looks like. All right, so ways that you can assist your student. I think that there's a lot of ways that parents can be helpful when students are considering where to live, whether for our upper class students that means on or off campus, or for our rising sophomore students that are required to live on as they think about which building they're wanting to try to live in and who they might be wanting to live with. So the biggest and most helpful thing you could do is have them pay attention to their email. All emails to students about this process are going to come from Housing and Residence Life to their Tulane email address. But every year we have students that don't check their email, they forget to apply late, and then are surprised when they can't select a room. So it's really, really important in general that students check their Tulane email, but definitely through this process, it's critical. I would also highly encourage you to encourage your student to attend a housing forum. Those will all be in the spring once they return from break. Those forums talk to them not only about the housing options that they're going to have, but the actual how to apply, how to make a roommate group, how to select their room. Students that attend those tend to be less stressed going through the process because they've seen screenshots of what the software looks like. They've seen video walkthroughs of how to do everything. And so I think that's a really important learning piece, especially for our rising sophomore students that have not had the opportunity to select their room previously. Help your students consider their needs and weigh their options. This is the time of year where students have to have some tough conversations with who they want to live with next year and who might be really great friends but might not be the best roommate pairings for them. You may have a student, for example, that has a large group of friends that want to live in an 8-person suite, but they tend to do much better when they're in smaller groups or have rooms to themselves. And so helping them consider what they need and what the best housing options for them is really important. Very soon, we'll be posting the 2018-2019 room rates as soon as those are approved by the university. And this can be a really important conversation for students to have with their parents. A lot of times, students don't necessarily think much about the cost of their housing, but as parents, that's likely something that you are cognizant of. And so it's definitely something that you'll want to take a look at so that your students know if there are types of housing in which you prefer them not to select in because of that rate. And lastly, we don't want any students to be confused or stressed out or feel like they don't know the process. And so please encourage them to reach out to our office if they have any questions at all so that we can assist them. Okay, so looking at some of the options that we have for students, we have residential learning communities for our upperclassmen that they can choose to select in. So we're going to talk a little bit about those before we move into the general housing options for students. So all of our building locations for our upper class communities are subject to change, and they may not be the same going for next year. But they are our upper class honors community, our change maker community, which focuses on creating positive social change, our get engaged community, which is very service oriented in the New Orleans community, Kaleidoscope, which is a community that focuses on diversity and identity, and then Shapers and Creators, which is our community for folks that are creative and artistic and like to create things, a lot of architecture and art majors and things of that nature. And so you can see in the majority of those communities, students have the opportunity to live in either double or single rooms. The majority of those are suite style, but again, those are not necessarily returning to the same community.
Maybe explain what you mean by suite style, which is really different from where first year students are.
Yes, thank you so much, Penny. That's a great. So our current freshman students are more than likely residing in a community that we would call a communal bathroom type community where the entire floor, half the floor shares a bathroom and a shower. The overwhelming majority of our upperclassmen options are what we would call suite style. So suite style is where 1, 2, or 3 bedrooms share a bathroom area. And so that could have anywhere from 2 to usually 4 people, our exception being Irby and Phelps, where you could have a suite of up to 8 students sharing a bathroom. It's typically just the bathroom that is shared between the rooms, with the exception of Aaron Apartments, which we'll talk about a little bit later. They have more of a living area. But yeah, so that is what we mean by suite style. There are community bath style housing available for upperclassmen in Warren Hall, but everything else besides Warren and the Aaron Apartments is suite style for upperclassmen. The housing application for residential learning communities is going to open as soon as students return back from winter break, and that will be due very shortly after they come back. So they'll have about a week when they return to apply for those residential learning communities. If a residential learning community is maybe not the right path for your student, we do have traditional housing, which does not have necessarily a residential learning component to it. So for Phelps and Irby are suite style 8-person suites. And so those are 4 double rooms that share a bathroom with 8 people in them. And then there are a couple 4-person units where 4 students can select together, and then they will share their bathroom with 2 of the student staff members on that floor. And then our other traditional housing options are Greenbaum, Mayer, Warren, and Willow. And Greenbaum, Mayer, and Willow are all suite style and all have doubles and singles. Warren Hall has doubles and singles. The majority of that building is community bathroom, but there are a few suites in there. The housing application for traditional student housing is going to open once students return on January 22nd, and that will be due February 23rd. So in that housing application, they have a number of weeks to go ahead and get their application in. We highly encourage students to go ahead and do their application as soon as possible, only so that they do not forget that they have an application to submit. And although they will get email reminders from our team. And lastly, our apartment style housing is our Aaron apartments. These residents are largely designed and geared towards juniors and seniors. Our juniors and seniors, by and large, choose to live in Aaron or Willow sometimes. There will be some sophomores living in Aaron, space permitting, but we try to make it very clear to our sophomore students that while they may really want to live in Aaron, they should definitely have a backup plan because those are largely geared for our juniors and seniors that will be returning to campus. These apartments have single and double rooms. The majority of the rooms in Aaron are singles. But there are some double rooms. There is a living room, a bathroom or 2, and a small kitchen. The apartments range from housing 3 to 5 people, and everything is included: electricity, water, cable, internet, and comes fully furnished. All right. So we have photos online of these spaces. We have descriptions of our amenities on our website, but there's nothing better than actually seeing the options that students may have for where they live. And so we will offer housing tours or our housing expo, as we like to call it, in the spring. And that is kind of an open house for students to visit, and they will be able to look at various housing options and different styles. And so on those evenings, we will have rooms available for students to view in all of our upper class areas. That will be publicized to students, and they'll be able to go to as many different buildings as they want to see spaces in. And then additionally, we also talked a little bit about our housing forum presentations in January and February. These are those presentations where we're going to really explain the process, walk through the housing portal, offer advice, and answer questions. And so these are 2 of the most important things a student can do to feel prepared going into the room selection process. Okay, so after those pieces, like we said, the students are going to go ahead and apply. And then after their application closes, the students are going to receive what we call a time slot. A time slot is basically the time that they will log into the system to select their room. The thing that students get to do as upperclassmen is they get to create what we call a roommate group. And so basically what they do is they go online and they create a group, and everybody in that group selects together. So the leader of the group, or the person that has the first time slot, will log into the system, will go to the building in which they hope to live, select the suite, and assign everyone to their rooms. So those time slots are really important because that will designate who should select the spaces for their rooms. Those time slots will let them know that when they will select, either between March 6th and March 15th. So a little bit about how rooms are selected in that order. March 6th will be room selection day for the residential learning communities. Residential learning community students that are accepted into those communities will only be able to choose from the rooms designated for those RLCs. So one of the questions that we get frequently from students is, well, if they're selecting first, are they going to take all the Aaron apartments or all the singles? And the answer to that is no, because they're not allowed to select from anywhere on campus. Students that are, for example, admitted into the upper class housing honors community will only be able to select the rooms that are designated for honors. So there's no real concern there of, whether they're in the RLC or the traditional pool of when they select, they'll be selecting with the type of housing that they're preferencing. Within the traditional and apartment housing selection dates, juniors and senior students are going to select first, and then juniors, and then sophomores. And again, that is done based on the amount of semesters that they've been on campus and when they started at the university, not by credit hour. Within their class year, their time slot is completely randomly assigned. And so this is a question we get all the time from students and parents. There is not a priority based on when they complete their application, as long as it is complete and submitted by the application due date. That is really the only kind of deadline there to make sure that they're included. Students that apply late will not receive a room selection time slot, and they will be assigned after the room selection process. So it is very important that our students apply on time. So all students who plan to live on campus, like I said, submit that application. Their application is not considered complete until they have signed their housing agreement. This is really what tells us that they want to live on campus for next year. And so all of the students that apply should get a room selection time slot, unless, for example, rising juniors and seniors change their mind and cancel their application later. And they will be able to go through and select their room. They will start receiving this information before they leave for break and when they come back, so that they know kind of all the dates and the processes that they'll need to follow when they come back. And this information is also going to be made available on the Housing and Residence Life website, which is housing.tulane.edu. So housing is open to all full-time undergraduate students. Unfortunately, we no longer house graduate students on the main Tulane campus. So if you have a current senior that's going to be pursuing a graduate degree next year, unfortunately, we're unable to house them on campus. We simply don't have the capacity to do so. Because our entire process is online, students that are currently on leave of absence or studying abroad are able to participate. The time of everything is Central Time. So I do know that, sometimes we have students selecting rooms in the middle of the night from abroad. Unfortunately, there's nothing we can do about that, but it is great that students still have some self-determination over the process, even when they're studying abroad. And the only thing that a student that's on leave of absence would need to know is that they are welcome to go through the process and select their room, but they will need to go ahead and register on time and get cleared to return from their leave, so that they can retain their housing after registration.
And just to clarify, this would be students who are on leave or studying abroad spring 2018 will go through this process to get a room assignment for next year, fall and spring. But if they're going abroad in the fall, then they only need spring 2019. Then they apply in November.
Yes.
Okay.
So this is a great and very common question. So students that are going to study abroad next spring 2019, should go through this process and choose a room for next fall. It is going to automatically assign our students to both a fall and spring assignment. In November, Housing and Residence Life will start communicating with students that are potentially going abroad of how to cancel that spring assignment and how to do so by a deadline to avoid a financial penalty. Students studying abroad in fall don't need to select a room because they won't be able to take occupancy of it in fall. And they will have their own reapplication process that happens in November, and get their housing assignments in December. If a student is unsure if they're going to study abroad for fall, I would highly encourage them to go through the process and select a room and then cancel once they know that they're going abroad, because getting a room after the fact will be much harder to get the kind of room that they might find desirable if they are returning for fall.
And if they're doing a Tulane Study Abroad program, then they would be released from their contract if they have that proof that they got accepted to a study abroad program like later than maybe
Yes.
the process. Okay.
Yes.
Okay, we're ready for the next.
All right. So as we said, we select in order of seniority. Our class status is determined by years on campus, not credit hours. I can't say that one enough. And every student will receive a time slot. We talked about the person in the student's group with the earliest time slot being the selector or the group leader, if you will. Every student will also have their own individual time slot. So let's say your student chooses to go through this process with a group of friends, and they have a bit of a falling out. Your student will still have their own time slot so that they can have their own ability to select their own room, should they later decide maybe this group is not who I should be selecting with. So when students log in during their time slot, they will be able to navigate to the different buildings that we have available and pull up suites, and actually assign themselves. So at the end of this process, they will know not only what building they're living on, but their exact room number. And so there's no kind of waiting for confirmation. They will assign themselves. So when they're in there, they will be able to see, is it a double room? Is it a single room? Is this an apartment? How many people are in our suite? And so there's a lot for them to kind of decide in that time.
On the screen, does it look like a floor plan?
On the screen, when they click on a specific room, it actually will show them a photo of the floor plan that they can zoom in on. And that's color coded to tell them what kind of rooms are available, whether they're singles or doubles, so that they can really kind of get the maximum amount of information.
Okay.
Yeah. So we suggest that the student with the earliest time slot becomes the group leader, because the earlier a student selects, the more availability there will be. Now, this is a position of responsibility because they do have to make sure that their group is solidified, and that everyone receives that housing assignment. Groups can be up to any size. The overwhelming majority of our suites on campus for returning students are 4-person suites or 2 double rooms that share a bathroom. There are, however, some 2-person suites of 2 singles or 3-person suites with a double and a single. Our apartments, like I said, can have 3, 4, or 5 people in them. There are 2 buildings, Phelps and Irby, in which can accommodate groups of up to 8. A really important note for the students selecting in Phelps and Irby is that they must fill all 8 beds in their suite to claim a suite in those communities. So if they're a group of 6 or 7, they need to find a buddy to pull into their group, because we have such an incredibly high demand for those suites that we only allow full groups of 8 to select there.
Okay, so now is the time for parents to type in your questions if you have any questions at this point. We hope we've answered most of them, but go ahead and start typing. I would ask for you to forgive us for the train that went by and that noise that was in the background. Sorry about that. Hopefully that didn't keep you from being able to hear. So one of the questions is if are sophomores considered upperclassmen?
So that's a really great question. In terms of housing, we typically talk about first-year housing and upper class housing. So we consider all of our returning students as upperclassmen. I think that term, though, in a lot of areas at the university kind of means juniors and seniors. And so when we say upperclassmen housing, we typically mean returning student housing.
Which would include sophomores, juniors, seniors.
Yeah.
Yeah. I do think that there's some inconsistency across the campus about that, so I apologize if that's been confusing. Also, I think we're trying to get away from using terms like freshmen and upperclassmen just to use gender neutral terms, but not everybody's kind of made that switch. So, so the next question is, if housing tours are in the spring, does that mean those tours happen after the deadline to apply? If so, that doesn't seem to make sense.
The housing tours are going to be in the very early spring during the application process while those are open. So all of the housing tours and the housing forums will be completed prior to students selecting their room.
So the application, at that point, they're not really selecting a room type unless it's that they're looking at the RLCs.
Right.
So they can still view the different types even after they've submitted the application, just so that it's in the system. And then it's the selection process where they narrow it down to the building, yes, right, for the traditional housing.
And when a student applies, one of the questions they're asked in their application is, what area are you interested in looking at and what kind of room? That is really just for our planning purposes in housing. When they go into select, they're going to have their option of any room type, no matter what they put in their application, with the exception of the RLC students who have to select within that community. But so just because they say they want to live in Erin on their application doesn't mean they can't select somewhere else when it's time to select.
And I really want to reinforce the idea of the value of those expos and tours, especially for those of you whose students are first-year students right now, because most of their friends are probably at this point other first-year students, and so they've probably only visited and really spent time in those buildings. But there's really a broader variety of room types and community types among those other buildings. And so especially if your student has found like the long hallway, we call them a double loaded corridor, there's a lot of traffic, lots of students, maybe 50 students on one long hallway that are walking back and forth all the time, a different building that has a different floor plan and layout, or maybe it's in suites and stuff. It can make a big difference in terms of the community interaction or the way sound travels and, just those kinds of things. And so it can be a real different feel and may be more conducive to their studying habits and that kind of stuff. So I think it's really good for them to keep an open mind about how the second year could be very different from the first based on some of the differences that are open to them in terms of the housing types. So here's another question. What if the student does not have someone in mind to room with, but doesn't want to be in a single? So
this is a great question. We have a lot of students that, they may have a lot of great friends on campus, but not a friend that they would want to live with. And so we will have roommate connection events for students to meet other students looking for roommates. Additionally, just like when they applied as a freshman, online, there's an online roommate search portion of the room, of the reapplication process. So students that know that they want to live together, they use that online room search just to find each other and put each other in a group. But students can also use that to search for other roommates that are compatible for them based on the questions we ask in the application, like, do you wake up early? Do you like to go to bed late? Those kind of questions. So they'll see results of students that are compatible with them that they can then message and kind of talk to them and see if they might be a good roommate fit. So there's a couple of different ways that we encourage students to seek out a roommate.
Okay, next question. What percentage of students who seek an RLC spot will get them?
That's a really good question. And I don't have the hard and fast percentage in front of me. The overwhelming amount of upper class students that apply for RLCs do tend to get into them. They're just, I think we took the
We've also added a lot of new ones lately, so we don't have a real long number of years of a track record to kind of compare.
Right.
So
I think the only one where that may not, where they may need to have kind of a backup plan is if they're applying for the upper class RLC for honors. But I do believe last year that the majority of students that wanted to be in that community ended up living in that community.
Do all of the applications for the residential learning communities require an essay of some type?
They do.
Okay.
So all of those communities have, I think, 4 to 5 short answer essays. So students will want to start those when they come back and give themselves ample time, because those essays are really the only thing that differentiates them from other students that apply.
Okay. Next question. For rising sophomores, are there many options for a group of 3 people?
There are not a lot of options on campus for a group of 3 in comparison to those for 2 or 4. I would encourage them to look for a 4th member. They are likely going to have a lot more options of where they want to live if they go through as a group of 4. But there are some 3-person suites. Those are predominantly in Willow. Willow residence is where they'd want to look at for 3-person suites.
But seniors and juniors are also attracted to Willow, and they would get to choose there first. So,
Correct.
Yeah, it would be harder for sophomores. What if they don't receive their first choice? Do they need to have some backup choices?
Students should definitely come with backup choices, especially if they are looking for highly sought after spaces. And we try to be very transparent with our students. If they are looking for an 8-person unit in Phelps and Irby, if they are sophomore students trying to live in Erin, or if they are pursuing single rooms, they should all have a backup plan. And so there are definitely students that will get their heart set on one building, and sometimes it is unfortunately full by the time they select. And so I would encourage them to have kind of a priority list for themselves, so that if that space is full, when they go to select, instead of kind of being frozen in the moment while other students are continuing to pick and choose room and take those offline, that they can kind of go down to the next option on their list.
That's really good advice. Does a single room mean that the student has the room to himself or herself?
Yes. So single room is single occupancy. The overwhelming majority of those on our campus, though, they will still share at least a bathroom with other students.
So it's 2 rooms joined by a bathroom. And I did want to point out, in those 8-person suites, the bathroom is more than just like 1 stall and 1 shower. So they're not as big as the big community baths in like Sharp or Monroe, but they're not just a single toilet and single shower, right?
Yeah, I think that there's at least 2 showers and 2 toilets in the majority of them.
Okay. Can a rising sophomore and a rising junior select a room together?
A rising sophomore and junior can select a room together. The junior would likely want to be their group leader, because they'll have an earlier selection time. The one thing we do watch for is, for example, a senior selecting with a group of sophomores into Erin, and then the senior cancels right after they're assigned. We are hip to that trick. So what they want to select with someone they legitimately want to live with, because when that student cancels, the way the system works is it will cancel everybody, and the remaining students will need to go back and reselect. So we don't want them to try that when they're on the clock choosing real assignments.
Okay. For the honors residence hall requirements, so what are those, and when do the students find out if they still qualify as honor students?
So priority for that community is given to students that are active in the honors program. And so if they are curious, if they're a member of the honors program, I would encourage them to reach out to the honors program to make sure, that they're still a member of it and active. But anyone is welcome to apply, because if we don't have enough honors students that apply to that community, then the next priority is for students that have applied for the honors RLC.
Okay. So, and you also get confirmation from the honors program from Newcomb Tulane College of who actually does meet the qualifications, correct? Or the students self-report that, or it's double-checked, or
yeah. So once the students apply, the students that are actually selected for the RLC, and this is the case for all of our RLCs. All of our RLCs have a partner. Either it's a department or a campus office. And those offices are who actually chooses to go into those communities. It's not Housing and Residence Life. We just kind of facilitate that process. And so the Honors College will choose those students, and then all students will receive a receipt back of their status and whether they've been accepted.
So this is a really great question. If a rising junior submits a housing application and then later decides to live off campus, what's our financial obligation? So what's the penalty for canceling?
Sure. So I'm going to refer folks to the housing agreement or the housing contract. And the new 2018-2019 contract will be available prior to selection for those exact penalties, because they are time dependent. And so depending on when a student cancels, that will dictate what their financial penalty will be. Now, a junior or senior that applies but chooses not to select does not have a penalty. But it's highly unlikely that they're going to get back into the kind of housing they want if they come late to the party and select after the fact. So students, juniors and seniors that aren't sure if they want to live off should probably go ahead and apply, and then hopefully they've clarified that prior to their selection date.
Okay. And so the penalty gets bigger the more time out from the selection process. So like the later they do. So they do need to clarify those decisions and everything. So okay.
And when that new housing agreement is approved and by the university, that will be posted on the Housing and Residence Life website under, I think it's agreement and rates. That is where both of those documents will be as soon as they're available.
Okay. Let's see. If a student's interested in an RLC, do they need to apply to both an RLC and regular housing option sort of as a backup in case they don't get accepted?
So the great thing is the housing application itself, where they go through and they sign the agreement, that is good for whether they live in an RLC or general housing. So they have to complete just one application. And then if they want to be considered for the RLCs, the only additional thing they need to do is the essay questions.
So if they're not selected for that first one, they'll be returned to the regular applicant pool for traditional housing.
Correct. And then they would select from a non-RLC room.
Okay. Do sophomore honor students who apply for the honors RLC and select Weatherhead get that selection?
If a student is a sophomore honor student that's active in the Honors College and applies to the Honors RLC, those applications go to honors for selection for the RLC. And so if they're admitted into the RLC, they will be able to select a room in Weatherhead. We only admit as many students into the RLC as there are beds in Weatherhead.
Do all the dorms have kitchens for students to use?
All of the residence halls have at least one communal kitchen. The majority of them, especially in upper class housing, have multiple, if not one or two per floor. But that is different. There are some buildings that only have one. And that information will be available to students when they select on our floor plans. But that's a great question if they have a specific building inquiry to call our office for.
How does a student pick a number of people to be in their group? If anything could happen once they get a slot, how do they cut out students from a group if they don't fit? How have you seen that work in real time?
Sure. So this is a really, that's a really good question. And this is one of those areas in which I would encourage them to have a plan. So for example, this most often happens with our students trying to select an 8-person group. Once those suites are full, there is nowhere else that can accommodate 8 people. So a lot of times what they do is they break into 2 groups of 4, and the 2 students with the earliest time slot then go select 4-person suites on the same floor of a different building. That's usually their best kind of backup option. And so what I usually tell the students, especially if they're looking at those larger group suites, is to have the backup plan of who wants to live with who and how they're going to divide their group in half if it's not available.
And who the leader will be, who has the best number.
Yeah.
The time slot.
And the other thing is, so sometimes, let's say, for example, Penny and I have the top 2 time slots and we want to be roommates. It still might make sense for us to divide our group and us be the group leader of the 2 separate groups, and then we can do some room changes afterward.
Because it's mutually agreed upon among those people. It's easier to do direct room swaps like that.
Correct.
Because everybody's part of a collaborative group.
Yes.
Okay. Let's see. So next question is, if your first year student received a housing accommodation to get a single room that was approved through the Goldman Office of Accessibility Services, how does that room selection process work for a sophomore then who needs that accommodation?
This is a fantastic question. Thank you so much for asking this. So if a student has a medical need for a certain type of housing space, they need to get an accommodation through the Goldman Center. It is highly encouraged that students do that as soon as possible, because not only do they need to apply, but they need to submit medical provider information. And so one of the things that will go out in the student email is a reminder of that, because for a lot of students, when they go home for winter break, that is the best time for them to go see those providers and get those letters so that they can apply when they get back.
So even if they got it the first year, they have to get all that documentation again, or
if they have
resubmit
an accommodation, that should carry over to their second year.
Oh.
But for students pursuing a new accommodation, they will want to do that as soon as possible,
Okay.
so that their accommodation is in place prior to selection.
Okay.
For students that have an approved accommodation, they have two options. They will be emailed directly from housing as to how they want to proceed. The difficult thing about accommodations is they apply only to the student that has them, not to all of their roommates. So those students can either come in and select with housing from a space that meets their specific accommodation needs, or they can go through the process if they want to select with roommates or suite mates, so that they can kind of have their cake and eat it too, if you will. So for example, a student that has an accommodation that would require them to live in Erin, if that student wants to ensure their accommodations met, housing can place them in Erin, but they will not be able to bring their roommates with them. If they would like to try to get a space in Erin with the people they want to live with, they'll need to go through the general process.
So the accommodation, it becomes the priority. Since that's been medically approved and there's been demonstrated a need for it, then that's going to be the top thing that dictates how they go about it.
Yep, and so that's why we try to give our students with accommodations as much option as possible to tell us how they want to go through the process, because for some students it is more important for them to live with their preferred roommates and suite mates than to be in a specific type of room.
Let's see. Will students be notified if they get the room they selected in summer, like first year students? They'll actually know this spring.
Yep. Students will know their room as soon as they're done selecting it.
Is there a junior residence hall that would be considered more quiet than others?
Our juniors and seniors tend to live in the Erin Apartments or Willow. And so I do think that those tend to be a little bit quieter, just because that is the layout
of the building is also like that. And yeah, and the older students tend to be a little more serious. They've gotten some of that wanting to hang out in the halls until all hours of the day and night and talking, doing stuff. It's also just, they're in Erin, they're self-contained apartments. So while they're, 4 levels of floors or 3, then the layout of the building just makes it so that the sound doesn't carry a lot from one to the other. So the same's kind of the case with the Willow residences. Those they do have hallways, but some of them also face sort of balcony or the center stairwell, and so it makes for less noise bouncing back and forth, I think. Next question is, are there written housing guidelines that provide the deadlines and procedures that need to be followed?
Yes. So students are going to get an email with all of the important dates and deadlines. And then on our website, it's not posted yet live, but we do create a room selection guide every year that walks them through each piece of the process, the relevant deadlines, and the most important things they need to pay attention to.
Let's see, here's one. If a group of 8 does not get the first choice that fits 8, how likely is it that group can get 2 4-person accommodations near or next to each other?
This was, I think, a really good option for students this past year. We had, using last year as our kind of basis for comparison, we had a lot of students that then were able to get 2 4-person suites close to each other.
I'm confused by the comment about posting the rates for housing. For first-year students, room and board was just room and board, a set price. Why would prices vary when you become a sophomore?
Great question. So prices vary based on the type of housing a student chooses. So a student that lives in a double room in a community bathroom style is not going to pay as much as a student that lives in a single room in an apartment. And so the prices are relatively consistent from building to building as long as the room type is consistent. So single rooms have a different price than double rooms. 4-person apartments, 3-bedroom apartments. You just kind of have to look at the price associated with the type of room. We break it down by building for extra clarity, but what you'll notice is if you look at a double suite style in Greenbaum, it's going to cost the same as a double suite style in Mayer. So the actual buildings don't cost different amounts. It's just the room types.
Okay. Can students room with someone of the opposite gender?
Students can choose to room with a student of the opposite gender. We do have a gender inclusive housing option that students can select on their housing application. They would make a gender inclusive roommate group, and then during their time slot, they would come into the housing office to select their room with us so that we could override anything that would prevent them from selecting together in the system. The system will naturally only allow students that are in our system as male to select with other men, and students that are in our system as females to select with other females. We do allow students to create gender inclusive groups, so we just have them select with us in the office so that we can assist them.
Because you have to manually override the computer system?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see. Given that the current sophomore class is bigger than it has been in previous years, do you expect that chances of getting housing will be limited?
So the rising sophomore class, our current freshman is the largest class in Tulane's history. The current sophomores are the next biggest class. So we do anticipate being full. On occasion, there will be a wait list at the end of room selection for students to get a room. These are usually students that did not apply on time and did not get to select with the rest of their class. But we will fill those, we will house those students off of the wait list as we have students cancel.
How close are the time slots?
The time slots are set by housing each year, and I think they typically go every 15 minutes or so.
Okay. So we've got a couple of questions that look like they were secondary questions, second parts of an earlier question, so I hope this will make sense. Does the last question about accommodations apply to students with dietary restrictions?
A student with a significant dietary restriction can apply for an accommodation, but it is typically things that are like life-threatening nut allergies and things of that nature where their health and well-being is significantly impacted by their diet because it has to rise to a certain level to be accommodatable.
Okay. Let's see. So somebody said that they missed something, and they asked, we were talking about Willow and what else. So if I don't get this right, if that person will retype your question just so that we can be sure. I would imagine that we were talking about Willow and Erin because those are near each other. They're across the street from each other, and that's where the seniors and juniors kind of gravitate.
And they tend to be a little bit quieter.
Yes.
Yep.
Yes. Okay. So I think that answered that question from the last comment I just saw typed in here. And then you said there were some 5-person suites?
There are some 5-person apartments
in Erin.
Yep. The only place for 5 people to live together on our campus is in an Erin apartment.
The answer to the room rate question, is there a large difference between the pricing, a big range?
The range is not... It's not huge between, for example, a single and a double. if you are looking at like a 3-bedroom apartment versus a community style, the difference there is it's not insignificant. Our current rates are posted online, and next year's rates will largely look similar in terms of the difference between the
rates,
two.
yeah, between styles.
All of the rates will likely be going up. I would say probably 3 to 4% of what they are now. Don't quote me on that until they come out as official. But the differences between like a single and a double room should remain largely the same.
So you get an idea of the range.
Yep.
And then you can steer your student towards the range you're most comfortable with. Does a student who is a rising sophomore need to reapply with new essays for a residential learning community?
Yes.
Yes,
and we have students reapply every year to make sure that the students that are living in those RLCs are students that truly want to be there again for the next year, so that we don't just assume they'd like to come back.
So I'm going to kind of make a last call for questions. And so type those in quickly if we haven't answered your question yet. One person said they joined late and asked if the materials will be posted. So yes, for everyone who registered for this webinar, I will send you an email by tomorrow afternoon with the recording, the video link, and a copy of these slides so you can review them again. And then probably by early next week, they'll be posted in the webinar archive on parents.tulane.edu under the communications tab. And then somebody asked, why are housing rates, why might they increase each year? What's driving the cost increase? And it's really kind of inflation with those kinds of things.
Yeah. Unfortunately, to know more, I think that's really a Board of Trustees question.
Yeah, not something we have any control over here between the two of us. Let's see. Are juniors and seniors required to have a meal plan? So no. Or are they? I'm sorry, did I misspeak? I apologize.
That is a really great question. And I would refer students to the meal plan website for that. Okay. Because I just don't want to say something incorrect on behalf of dining.
Okay.
Sorry.
So I'll include in the follow-up message, I'll try to get that answer from the meal plan office before I send you the follow-up. So I would say don't expect the email follow-up message until later tomorrow afternoon, and I'll get that clarified, and I'll include a link to the meal plan website in the follow-up email that I send you. Let's see. So there's one question that, let's see, can you please repeat the most popular room building choices where students need to have a backup ready? And so that's the 8-person suite in Irby and Phelps. Yep. Because there's just a limited number of those. Mm-hmm. They're not huge buildings like Sharp and Monroe.
Yes, and then I would also say that for sophomore students, rising second year students, I would also have a backup plan if they are trying to obtain a single or to live in the Aaron on-campus apartments. One other question that I saw us scroll by was asking basically if a student will receive any type of priority based on their current housing situation. And unfortunately, I think the answer to that is that all students' housing assignment time slots are done randomly within their class. We will have a lot of students that maybe didn't get their first choice this year, or were in a triple room, or had a bad roommate experience, and we are certainly sensitive to those things, and we want to get them set up in a place for success for next year. But unfortunately, if we started doing that, then there really wouldn't be a lot of objectivity in terms of how our students select. And it's just impossible to give them priority based on those type of things. And so while we certainly care about the experience that they're having this year, it does not necessarily give them priority for next year.
So I do think it becomes really important that they go to all those presentations and they go check out the different spaces and they walk through them and see some examples of each room type, and really think about those different options that they have. And especially consider, if they didn't consider a residential learning community, to really look at some of those themes and topics that are guiding the programming and the shared experiences in those, because it might really be something that appeals to them, and it'd be worth writing that essay to apply. So the last question I think that we'll have here then is, are microfridges supplied in the rooms housing 4 or 8 students?
Microfridges are supplied in every single housing room, with the exception of the Aaron apartments, because they have a full-size refrigerator in their kitchen.
They even have dishwashers. So they have small stove, oven, dishwasher, and a fridge.
So they don't have in-room fridges, but they do have an in-unit fridge.
So I think this will be our last question. If you have 8 students, can they live in 4 doubles as a roommate group rather than an 8-person suite? So I think so.
Sure. So the good question. So the 8-person suite is 4 doubles that are connected by a bathroom. And so those are in Irby and Phelps. And so there are actually no single rooms available in those communities. And so they would be living in 4 doubles that share a bathroom. If they don't want to live in that 8-person suite, but there are 8 students that want to live together, they would want to select in 2 groups of 4 to try to get suites next to each other. The reason for the differentiation there is that the group leader can only assign students within the suite. So once they assign their group of 4, they could not then assign another group of 4 to a suite next to them. That group would need its own group leader.
And I'm not sure if this is what that question was asking, but if it were that there were 8 people who all want to live on the same floor, but in doubles, then they're going to be looking at something like Weatherhead or Greenbaum or Mayor or Warren. And so then I think they just need to kind of decide probably who has the best time slots and decide on a priority of what floor they might like to be on. And I guess if they didn't all end up on the same floor, after the whole process is over, they might be able to come back and talk about some room swaps. But it's going to be a little trickier, I think, to know that, given there's so many people that could be going through the process, that there'd just be 4 rooms right in a row that are all going to be open at the same time when they will have different times. So I hope that explains that. So one question was, are there any housing expos before the break? And no, because everybody is hunkering down to finish their last papers and the last week of class and get ready for final exams. And so we wait until the spring semester when everything's kind of starting fresh again and they don't have as many academic commitments, at the very beginning of the semester. So, but we thought that arming you, parents, with this background can help you prompt some conversations with your students over the break. So we thought that it would be useful for you to have this information now. And we have presented this sometimes in early spring semester, but parents have kind of asked for this more, and we thought it might make those that winter break time conversation more productive if you had this information now. So that's something you can give me feedback about if you'd like. If you think it would be better to wait until January to do this, or if you found it particularly helpful that we're doing it now. So a lot of you, especially if your parents are first-year students, you're more in the know than they are right now about how this process is going to work. So don't let that surprise you if you start to talk to them about this. But that might be kind of helpful for you. So one last question was, are floors co-ed? So yes, in some places the floors are co-ed.
Yep. The majority of our upper class housing, the floors are co-ed because they're suite style. And so students are, their bathroom is in with their suite. The one upper class exception to that is Warren, because that has community style bathrooms. And so those floors are single gender. So
there might be one floor men and another on the other end of the building is female, or from one level to the other is different.
Yes.
Okay. Well, if you have any further questions, you can email housing@tulane.edu. And if you have any last feedback that you want to give us, you want to type that in now before we close, you're welcome to do that. Or, as I mentioned, send feedback to parents, PARENTS, tulane.edu. So thanks, everyone. We are glad that you are interested in this topic and hope that you found this helpful. So we will close soon. So thanks very much. Have a great night.
Thank you.